to ECFR Quarantimes. My name's Susie Dennison. I'm the Director of the European Power Programme at ECFR, and I'm delighted to have the honour of chairing the 7th Quarantimes episode this afternoon. COVID-19 is changing the world, but are Europeans ready to change with it? With this series of ECFR Quarantimes, we're enlisting the brightest voices to think beyond the immediate response to the COVID-19 crisis and overcome our pre-existing biases and beliefs to shape Europe's future role in the post-corona world. And I'm really delighted that this afternoon we are joined by Professor Carlos Lopes. Carlos Lopes will be known to many of you. He's the African Union's High Representative for Partnerships with Europe, and he's also Professor at the Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. We're going to be discussing with him today how COVID-19 is shaping the Europe-Africa relationship and what to expect of that partnership going forward. With that, I would like to give the floor to you, Professor Lopes. You have written a number of striking pieces lately, encouraging us to focus more on the economic impact of COVID-19 in Africa and look at the role of the international community in engaging with that. Would you like to kick us off with some comments to that, please?
Thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed the opportunity of being with you. I think the African context for COVID is very peculiar. There is a number of factors that are still unknown, and we are ready for basically preparing ourselves for the main dimension of the crisis that is going to be economic, not necessarily sanitary. Why do I say that? Particular demographics in Africa show that the comorbidities that have been quite lethal in other parts of the world will not be sufficiently present in the composition of the characteristics and the morphology of epidemic here in Africa. I know for sure that because of the preparedness that we have had for previous pandemics, that Africa has a certain level of resilience that has not been studied enough. And we also are aware of the fact that a certain number of factors that have to do with the virology dimensions of this pandemic are associated with seasonality. We know that all respiratory viruses normally have seasonality. So it is pretty much unknown territory why Africa has been not as affected as other parts of the world. It can also be because we have very poor statistics, with 60% of the population not having even civil registration. It is hard to know exactly how, sort of certificates of disease are established in different countries. So there is a lot of guessing. But this being said, we know for sure that from an economic point of view, it's going to be devastating. Why? Because there are factors on the economic front that make Africa really quite vulnerable. The first is climate related. The fact that we have a number of phenomena that is very much linked to climate that is unfolding during this year, 2020, like the cricket's invasion, locust invasion in the Horn of Africa, the floods in Eastern Africa, very long drought in parts of Southern Africa, pervasive conflicts relating to environmental stress in the Sahel. So these are factors that are not helping food security, and we know that we are going to brave for a very difficult year from a food security point of view. Then you have factors that have to do with the volatility of our currencies resulting from a macroeconomic context that is fragile and has been deeply affected by turbulence in the global markets, namely the war between US and China for trade regimes, and also the US withdrawal from multilateralism, including from the WTO. The fact that we have Russia and Saudi Arabia fighting for the price of oil. So all of this has affected commodities prices even before COVID. Now we have, coupled to that, very low demand. And we know also that we are facing particular challenges in terms of logistics because of the characteristics of our continent. So the combination of all these factors make for a very poor year in terms of trade. And of course, trade represents quite a significant chunk of public resources. Unfortunately, African countries are not very good at dealing with fiscal pressure. We have one of the lowest in the world, so our taxes are not commensurate to the needs of the public social sector. As a result, health is the first affected by all these restrictions, and we need some sort of relief, and that's what I will discuss with you during this session. But this being said, I think Africa also has demonstrated that it was in the right path. Before COVID, the predictions of the IMF for January this year, not that long ago, were that 16 of the 30 best performing countries in growth terms in the world were going to be African. And about half of the population of the continent was going to live in countries with 5% growth or more. So that's significant, 650 million people living in countries with high growth. And obviously, this is something to bear in mind also. We have a certain number of economies that account for quite a big proportion of our combined GDP, namely Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt, together about 60%. And the three of them have very peculiar macroeconomic situations. Egypt is doing slightly better over the last 2 years, but Nigeria and South Africa have been suffering from very poor and low growth. And as a result, they influence the statistics of the continent. So when you see the averages that are being mentioned here and there, please bear in mind the fact that these three economies are actually contributing a very important proportion of those averages, and therefore sometimes does not reflect as much progress as we have attained. So COVID is exacerbating all these characteristics I just described. And all of them are pointing in the direction of a very low U-shaped growth curve for Africa, because when it comes to commodities, demand is not going to pick up immediately. It's going to, basically last in terms of crisis for quite some time. And some of the commodities are very much linked to future markets. So orders that are placed today are more for, next year, mid-spring. You have some commodities, soft commodities, that are very much dependent on logistics. So we are going to lose part of the production of cocoa, of tea, of cashew nuts, of different commodities that are very vulnerable. And we have also the migrants that account for a quite significant proportion of our stability in terms of our balance of payments. And, the expectation is that about 30% less of migrant remittances, which is much more important than ODA, as you know. ODA also is stuck. We have seen from the various discussions taking place that most of the ODA is actually reprogramming, it's not additionality, which means that it's going to compromise next year quite significantly unless there is a movement in a different direction. And obviously, all these externalities are exacerbated also by the fact that we are using more local currency to pay our debts, servicing the debt, particularly the commercial debt, obviously, since that one is not part of the negotiations taking place for standstill. And we have also the volatility of the currencies themselves contributing for a macroeconomic fragility. So if we take all of this into account, we can say that we are going to have a much longer period of crisis because 2/3 of our growth come from domestic demand that is now very much limited by confinement, by a very tremendous shock on our formal sector, with a paralysis on the informal sector. And therefore, we can brace ourselves for losing maybe about 14 to 20 million jobs, as it has been predicted by some of the analysts. And we can really, without hesitation, say that we are going to have the worst year in the last 30. So this is going to be a very difficult period for Africa, and it's going to compromise, unless we do something energetic, it's going to compromise gains that have been attained over the last 2 decades.
And maybe picking up from that final point that you make, you are former executive secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. What is your assessment so far to the international response to that picture, and what for you were the sort of the priorities in terms of action in tackling the frightening economic prospects out there?
Well, if I pull together all the announcements that have been made by the multilateral financial institutions, they amount to a very little contribution to this crisis. We have the World Bank and the IMF are probably the ones with the largest availability of funds towards Africa. But when you translate what has been approved so far in macro terms, for the entire continent, we are talking about a sum that is about $15 billion. If you take into account other multilateral development institutions, not just financial, we are talking probably roughly on a figure that should approach about $30 billion. Africa needs no less than 5% of its GDP to be able to go through this crisis, like we have seen in all economies around the world that have stimulus packages that are considered as, sort of effective. That means about $200 billion. From 30 to 200, we are quite far from what is needed. And I don't see really from the bilateral front much progress in terms of the discussion so far. I see a lot of goodwill. For instance, the discussions at the G20 are promising. But so far, what has been approved is really very little, which is a standstill of debt servicing for 1 year. It's very little. And it doesn't concern all the African countries, as you know. It's only the IDA eligible countries, which is a very small fraction. I see very good words coming from different partners of Africa, including from the European Union. But there is zero additionality. And so far it's all about reprogramming. And that is really far from meeting the needs. Partly because if you reprogram, you are going to compromise restarting of the economies and recovery period.
You wrote earlier this year in your piece for Project Syndicate and elsewhere, and about the importance of green growth as part of the economic future for Africa. Looking at that sort of picture now in the midst of the COVID crisis, what is your assessment of the extent to which the urgency that we felt around tackling climate change at the beginning of this year has somehow been replaced now by health security as a primary concern? Or do you in fact feel that there is a sort of a real opportunity through greening the recovery to move both agendas forward simultaneously?
I strongly believe we never had such a chance like today to actually green our economic transformation, and in particular our industrialization. Why? For three reasons. The first reason is because the prices of fossil fuels are at record lows, which means that countries that have entangled their tax system to fuel subsidies can get rid of those fuel subsidies like never before. It will not affect the consumer. The demand is depressed and the prices are low, and they will not have another chance like this one. So COVID is like helping get rid of the fuel subsidies. And if we are going into a recovery mode that requires any sort of subsidies, those should be directed to the greening of the economy. So this is a unique chance. So you have to seize it. The second reason why I'm so optimistic is because the costs of producing renewables are now very competitive. And in most instances, not all, but in most instances, it's actually cheaper to go renewable and faster, that's a very important element, than to go the fossil fuel route. So again, because recovery will require faster action and will require cheaper production, this is a unique opportunity to, again, invest on renewables rather than fossil fuels. And the third reason is because we have now seen during this crisis that the first instinct of different countries that are quite well positioned in the global value chains is to actually go protectionist for the goods that matter to them. It can be, in this case, health-related or protective equipment. But, Africa has been cut off from imports on pharmaceuticals and protective equipment early on, and was obliged to basically rely on goodwill of some countries, namely China. And it's not even China as a country, it's more foundations and private entities in China. And then the second reason is because we have discovered a level of innovation in Africa to deal with such protectionism that we didn't know existed. Like, for instance, a number of countries that actually can produce protective equipment can even reconvert some of their informal sector to be participants indirectly in global value chain, in local value chains. And we have discovered also the pharmaceutical industry in Africa is not inexistent. Although it has limited means, it could boost those means quite considerably, precisely because there was a crisis. So if you take these three elements into consideration, they all point in the direction of, greening our industrialization. And why do I mention the third one as well? Because the third one means that we are going to have less emissions if we produce closer to the consumption market, which is what our free trade area is going to promote. And this is just a good entry point for us to make the political, case for the free trade area. Obviously, there is a debate in Africa whether the free trade area can proceed according to the calendar that was approved in the different decision-making bodies of the African Union. And my position is that, no, we cannot proceed according to that calendar. For exceptional times, you need exceptional circumstances and exceptional responses. And I think we have to adjust. But the political momentum should not be lost.